Hi, I'm Joy Axelson, and in this lecture we will be looking at Hebrews chapter 11 through 13 and also a final application. You know, over the years I've heard people talk about faith from Hebrews 11, but sometimes they define faith as you have to believe enough to receive your healing, or you have to believe enough to receive some financial gift or some physical thing from God. And sometimes that definition of faith can be seen as a selfish type of faith, and also that it can cause people to feel guilty that they had not received what they prayed for or their healing. And it can make people feel bad that they had sinned or they did something wrong, so they did not have enough faith. But if we look at the context of the author, what he's talking about in chapter 11 of the Old Testament examples is that many of these Old Testament saints, that they suffered, that they endured persecution and hardship in their life, but that they kept the perspective. And the author says that God saw them as being faithful and having lives of faith. But even though they suffered, what they suffered was temporary, that they always kept in mind the something greater, that God's promises were greater. And so they could endure their suffering and hardships in their present life for hope of something greater, of better, of eternity with Christ. That they kept their eyes on the goal, on Jesus, that they endured temporary suffering on this earth for greater eternal gain. And so the book of Hebrews, the author defines faith as a human's response to God's faithfulness, to His promises, that it's about His trustworthiness, not our own. But we are called to a life of faith, of faithfulness to God, to trust His promises that are now and not yet. That this will get the original reader and us through difficult things in life. It's not talking about a selfish faith, about what I can get for myself. But throughout this book, we've seen how the author has called the original reader to be faithful to God, just as God has been faithful to them throughout their history. And that Hebrews calls for a continuous faith that will help them endure suffering. So, chapter 11 talks about Old Testament believers who were faithful even in the midst of great difficulties. But they continued in this faith until the end. So these Old Testament saints give an example for the original reader of people who started in faith, who've lived in faith, who were faithful unto the end. So the author here is not talking about just a one-time faith for getting something specific, but he's talking about a life of faith, a life of being faithful to God and having a perspective of trusting God for the completion of His promises, which maybe are not seen all on this earth, but will be fulfilled completely in heaven. In verses 32 through 38 of this chapter, you do see a lot of people who had great victories, amazing miracles, but you see a shift in verse 36 where the author then talks about people who didn't see what we would consider great victories, that they suffered, they experienced persecution, even death. But for God's interpretation of both those who experienced great and wonderful things in their lives and those who only endured suffering, God still saw them as both being faithful, that they were still victorious in their lives. They were still successful in their lives of faithfulness. And so the author shows throughout the book of how Jesus was faithful in His action and is calling the original reader to be faithful in their walk of faith. And then on in Hebrews 11 verse 39 through 40. And all these, though commended through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, that they had waited for the Messiah. They were waiting for the completion of God's promises, but they didn't see it in the Old Testament. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So the author is saying that, hey, original reader, you have seen the fulfillment of God's promises of Jesus, the Messiah, coming. And that the Old Testament believers, that they were looking towards the cross. They had to wait for completion of salvation through Jesus, whereas the New Testament believers are looking back at the cross. And so the original reader should be encouraged that they got what the Old Testament believers had been waiting for Jesus. That they should be encouraged to persist in their faithfulness to God. And the author starts out chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 of them to look at the ultimate example of faithfulness, who was Jesus. That he was faithful, he was superior in his faithfulness. So let's read that. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So here the author shows Jesus as the ultimate example of faithfulness. And the cloud of witness here is talking about the Old Testament saints, and that he listed in Hebrews chapter 11. He's not talking about actual people sitting in the clouds watching us, but that these Old Testament saints should be an example of witness for the original reader, that they should follow their example. To lay aside every weight and every sin that clings so closely to us. The Roman runner competitors, they would take off most of their clothes so that nothing would cling to them and keep them from running at their best. So the author is saying, lay aside anything that would hinder you from running the race towards Jesus, of any sin, of even good things that would hinder you. And to look to Jesus, look directly at Jesus and draw courage from him. That he is the founder and perfecter of our faith, that he's the pioneer, he's the finisher of salvation, which was made perfect through the sufferings of Jesus on the cross. That he endured pain, he endured humiliation and the shame of the cross, that he was the ultimate witness of commitment, faith that God honors. So that he got joy in the end. He knew the joy of receiving those who believe in him, of those who accept his salvation. So the original reader, that they too can endure in faith. They are to consider him. They are to weigh up carefully the endurance of Jesus, and that if he can endure, they can take courage and strength from him, and they too can endure. Going on in verse 4 through 11, the original reader are called to endure disciplinary suffering that God allows and God uses to make them grow into spiritual maturity. The author encourages them that this is evidence that God sees them as his children, as his daughters, as his sons, that this suffering is a way to train them for a life of godliness. And then it talks about, though, in verse 4, in your struggle against sin. And think about what is the overall picture of sin that the author talks about in this book. It's the sin of unbelief, of rejection of Jesus' work on the cross. And so that's what he's talking about there, of not leaving the faith, of not going towards that sin. And on in verse 14 through 25, we're given the fifth warning in the book of not rejecting the greatest revelation, of turning away from Christ is worse than Saul's turning away his birthright or rejection of the law at Mount Sinai. So let's look at verse 15, where it says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble. By it many may become defiled. And he goes on and talks about Esau, how he gave up, he was sexually immoral and unholy, that he gave up his birthright for a single meal. And even when he tried to get back his birthright, he was crying that it was too late, that Esau had exchanged his inheritance right as a son just to get a full stomach. And he lost the right to it. It was foolish. And that he could not change the bad consequences of his bad choice. And so the root of bitterness that the author talks about in verse 15 may refer to Deuteronomy 29:18, where it warns the people of the dangers of individual and corporate idolatry, of how it's very contagious. And so he's challenging the original reader that if you see one that is thinking about shrinking back from the faith, or is thinking about leaving the faith and going back to Judaism, encourage them to stay, because it's very contagious and very tempting for other people to leave the faith. But the author is saying we need to encourage each other. We need to challenge each other even when we're suffering temporary persecution. Keep in light eternal perspective. And don't leave the faith just for a sake of momentary comfort, just like Esau. Don't make a bad choice that will affect your eternity. And then the author goes on in verses 18 through 29, and he gives a contrast. And he shows the experience of Israel on Mount Sinai when God spoke to Israel and he showed himself and he gave them the law. And this is out of Exodus chapters 19 and 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 4 and 5. And then the author contrasts this with the believer's experience of the eternal spiritual city of Jerusalem, of heavenly Mount Sinai. And when God gave the old law during Moses' time, Israel was in the wilderness, and God had warned them that he was going to come and visit Mount Sinai, that he was going to show his presence, that they were to sanctify themselves, purify themselves. They were not to touch the mountain or they would die. And so God came with lightning and with thunder, and the people were so afraid that they just said, Moses, you go and you speak to God. We can't deal with this. And so the contrast that the author brings is this picture here of what happened in Exodus and Deuteronomy. And so he describes the Old Covenant, Mount Sinai, as may be touched as something physical, that it blazing fire, the darkness, tempest. The hearers, they were so afraid when God came with all his glory on Mount Sinai. And there was death for those who came near, and that even Moses was afraid. But the picture of the new covenant, of the heavenly Mount Sinai, the author describes as the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the angels and their festive gathering. You have the picture of the firstborn, of the spirits of the righteous being made perfect, and that's talking about the Old Testament saints, including Abe. And we see that God is there, that Jesus is the mediator. And so here the author is showing this contrast to the original reader. Which one do you choose? Do you choose the Old Covenant, which is fear, which is just physical, or do you choose the New Covenant, with the hope and the promise of eternity with God? How can you give up the old for the new? In verse 24, we have the reference to the sprinkling of blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. That might refer to the fact that Abel had the first sacrifice in the Old Testament, and he was the first martyr, and that his blood called out for justice against sin, of his innocent blood that was shed. In the same sense that Jesus' innocent blood, so Abe's death was a type or shadow of Jesus's death, of where his innocent blood provided salvation for everyone, that provided mercy for all sinners. And then the author goes on in verse 25 and 26 is a warning and a picture of everything shaking. It's like the end of the world, the end of this age, that how Israel throughout all of their history had a bad attitude of unbelief of God, and the consequences of the lack of faith would bring judgment on them, and how the author is saying to the original reader, hey, listen, deal with your problems. Know that God will vindicate you at the end, that God will deal with your enemies, but stay faithful and trust God. Chapter 13, we're not going to go into any detail about. It deals with some specific problems with the original reader. They needed to follow their leaders. They needed to remember and honor and follow the examples of their former dead leaders. Remember, this church is about 30 years old. And so you go through that chapter and really think about it and interpret it. Throughout this book, we see how the author showed the original reader that Jesus is superior to everything. That he warned them continuously that not to let their present temporary suffering make them turn away from eternity, from their salvation in Jesus. They have to keep the eternal perspective in mind, that what they're suffering now is so little in comparison of what they were experiencing with Jesus and being in God's presence in heaven. That are they going to take a temporary, easy, unpersecuted life now, or are they going to endure that now so that they can have much greater in heaven with Jesus? And as I've been studying through this book, one thing that's really stuck out to me for final application was the references to endurance, of how Hebrews chapter 3 verse 6 talks about, let us hold fast to our confidence and our boasting and our hope. In Hebrews 4:14, let us hold fast to our confidence. Hebrews 6 verse 18, let's have strong encouragement to hold fast to our hope that's set before us. In Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast to the confidence of our hope, that without wavering, for the promise, who has promised is faithful. In Hebrews 12:1 and 2, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus. So the idea of holding fast, of endurance, is constantly through this book, that the Christian faith is a race of endurance, that Jesus is our ultimate example of faithfulness, and he is our help to endure. That faith in Jesus is that he is the source of strength which provides endurance. That a heavenly perspective is important if we are able to endure. The good things, the sin can hinder us in our race, then we have to deal with them. Immaturity in our faith, in our beliefs, produce a lack of faith, which can result in a lack of endurance, just like the original reader. So endurance is the idea of go get it, of aggressiveness, of yet being patient and sticking in their attitude. So how can we endure through our walk in life as Christians? We need to help each other. We need to encourage each other in this race. We need to keep our eyes on Jesus, focused on Jesus, and not our own personal situation and problems. We will face hardships. Christianity does not promise an easy life, but we have to push onward. And we have to focus not on the now, but the hope of eternity with Jesus when we finish at the end. So I've got some questions here just for you to think about as you do your own application. Realize that you didn't do a thing for your salvation, that your high priest Jesus did, that you only received and believed it. Have you experienced any sufferings in the past? What did you learn from it? How can it help you now? Is there anything, good or bad, that is hindering you in your present Christian race? What is your present perspective on life? Do you have a worldly perspective, or do you have a heavenly perspective? Or do you need to think about that, meditate on that, and change your perspective? Do you need strength to endure what you're going through now? Do you need to reach out to some fellow believers to give you encouragement and to pray with you? Just as a final thought, we need to keep looking to Jesus, not our circumstances or the things going on around us, but we need to keep the promise of the eternal perspective always in mind. We have to deal with things that might hinder us in our race, and we need to stay faithful to God and to His promises, because He is always faithful to us. Thank you.